There are European names written into the DNA of nearly every Black American alive today. Not a trace, not a rounding error. On average, almost a quarter of the entire genome. And for generations, the specific identity of those Europeans, where they came from, and how they got into the bloodline was one of the great blank spaces in African American history. The records were silent on purpose, but the DNA was never silent, and what it is now revealing is a map of exactly who they were. Drawn in the one place, the truth could not be erased. For most of American history, a Black family in the United States could look at itself and see the evidence with their own eyes. A grandmother, lighter than she should be, gray or hazel eyes appearing out of nowhere, a texture of hair, a shape of a face, a European surname carried for generations with no story attached to explain it. Everyone could see that something had entered the family line. Almost no one could say precisely what or who or from where. And the not knowing was not accidental. It was manufactured. Slavery deliberately destroyed the records that would have answered these questions. Enslaved people were listed in ledgers as property, without surnames, without parentage, without the paper trail. Every other American family could follow back through the generations. The one thing every Black family could see, the evidence written on their own faces, was the one thing the written record refused to explain. The question hung over millions of households for a century and a half, unanswerable until now. Because researchers at the genetics company 23andMe, in a landmark study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, measured the ancestry of thousands of self-identified African Americans and found something that is both entirely expected and still staggering to see written down. The average African American genome is roughly 73% African, but nearly a quarter of it, around 24%, is European. And a small remainder, under 1% on average, is Native American. 24% is not a footnote. It is not a distant ancestor 500 years back. A quarter of the genome means European ancestry sitting only 2, 3, 4 generations deep in the average Black American family. It means it is not the exception in African American heritage. It is the rule. Almost every Black family in the country carries it. So the question this DNA forces us to ask is not whether the European ancestry is there. That is settled beyond any doubt. The real questions are the ones the history books left blank. Which Europeans were they? Where in Europe did they come from? And how exactly did they end up woven so deeply into the bloodline of a people they had enslaved? The DNA answers all three. And the answers tell the true story of America more honestly than any textbook ever has. Start with the first question, the one the title of this video promises. Which Europeans? The answer is not random, and it is not evenly spread across the continent. It maps almost perfectly onto the specific Europeans who held power over enslaved people in each region of the American South. The DNA is not just telling you that Europe is in the bloodline. It is telling you which Europeans, in which places, because it remembers who was standing over whom. Ancestry does not enter a population by chance. It enters through the people who were physically present and held power. And in the American South, the people present and holding power were the colonizers and enslavers of each particular region. So the genetic map of European ancestry in Black America is, in effect, a map of who ruled where. Across most of the South, the dominant European signature in African American DNA is British and Irish. This is no accident. The American colonies that became the slave-holding South were above all British colonies. The plantation owners, the overseers, the men who held legal and physical control over enslaved people across Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and the wider Cotton Belt were overwhelmingly of British and Irish descent. And so the European ancestry that entered Black families in those states carries their genetic fingerprint. When a Black American from Mississippi or South Carolina or Alabama sees a large slice of British and Irish ancestry in their results, they are very often looking at the genetic shadow of the exact people who owned their ancestors. And the odd concentration is striking. In the heart of the old Cotton South, in states like Mississippi, Arkansas, and Tennessee, British and Irish ancestry is not just present in the wider population, it is the single largest European component by a wide margin. That is the population that built the plantation economy, and that is the population whose ancestry seeped through the violence of slavery into the black families held captive within it. The DNA of Black Mississippi and the DNA of the men who ran Mississippi are at the European level, the same DNA. That is not a coincidence. It is a confession, but move to certain corners of the South and the signature changes, and it changes for reasons that are pure history. In Louisiana and along the Gulf, you find French ancestry threaded through the black population in a way you do not see elsewhere. That is the mark of French colonial New Orleans, of a territory that was French before it was ever American, where the population, the culture, and the power structure were built by France. The genetic record of Louisiana still carries the accent of that history in the bloodline as much as in the place names. And along the Gulf Coast, into Florida, and out toward the Southwest, you find Iberian ancestry, Spanish and Portuguese, the legacy of early Spanish colonization of those regions centuries before the United States reached them. Read that map carefully, and it becomes something extraordinary. The European ancestry in a Black American's DNA is a record of which empire controlled the ground their ancestors were enslaved on. British in the Cotton South, French in Louisiana, Spanish along the Old Gulf and Southwest frontier. The bloodline is a colonial map, and every black family is carrying a piece of it, whether they ever knew the history or not. A person could lose every document, every family story, every name, and still encoded in their DNA would be the answer to which flag flew over the land where their people were held. That is how deeply this history is written into the body. It is not in an archive that can burn or a courthouse that can be closed. It is in the cells themselves, passed down intact, waiting for the technology that could finally read it aloud. Which brings us to the second question, the hard one. How did it get there? We have to be honest about this, because the honesty is the entire point. The European ancestry and African-American DNA did not, in the main, arrive through marriage or courtship or anything that resembled a union between equals. It arrived through the machinery of slavery itself. To imagine otherwise, to picture quiet romances across the color line, is to misunderstand what slavery was and to soften something that should never be softened. A handful of such relationships surely existed. They were the rare exception. The overwhelming reality was something else entirely, and the DNA does not let us look away from it. And the DNA proves this in a way that is almost unbearable to look at directly. In 2020, a team of 23andMe researchers led by Stephen Micheletti published a second landmark study in the American Journal of Human Genetics, combining the genetic data of more than 50,000 people on both sides of the Atlantic with the historical records of the slave trade. They were able to measure not just how much European ancestry was present, but which sex it came through. And what they found was a stark, brutal imbalance. The European ancestry in African Americans came overwhelmingly from European men. The African ancestry came overwhelmingly from African women. To grasp the scale of that imbalance, consider the numbers the researchers put to it. Between 1525 and 1866, an estimated 12.5 million people were forcibly taken from Africa and shipped across the Middle Passage. The majority of those captured and transported were men. And yet, when you read the gene pool of their descendants today, African women contributed far more to it than African men did. In the United States, enslaved women contributed to the modern gene pool at around 1.5 times the rate of enslaved men. In parts of Central and South America and the Latin Caribbean, the imbalance was staggering, with enslaved African women contributing 13 to 17 times more than enslaved men. The only way a minority of women outproduces a majority of men in a population's ancestry is if those women were being forced to bear children they did not choose to bear. In the researchers' own words, this pattern reflects the sexual exploitation and rape of enslaved women by their enslavers. It was not incidental to slavery. It was woven into it. Enslaved women had no legal ability to refuse the men who owned them, And the genetic evidence of that reality is now carried in the body of nearly every one of their descendants. When the study looked at people of African descent across the Americas, it found again and again that they were far more likely to have European fathers in their lineage than European mothers in almost every region of the hemisphere. As one Howard University professor put it when the study was released, the fact that enslaved black women were raped by their masters is not a surprise to any black person living in America. The community always knew. It was carried in the family stories, in the unexplained surnames, in the faces around the table. What the DNA did was take that long, quiet, painful knowledge and make it undeniable. It put the hard science behind what the people already understood in their bones, and it did so with a precision no historian working from paper records alone could ever have reached. If you are following how completely this science confirms what was hidden for so long, take a moment to subscribe, because recovering exactly these buried truths with the evidence to prove them is the entire reason this channel exists. What comes next matters just as much as everything you have heard, because the same DNA that names the pain also refused to let the African core of the story be erased. And that is where the record turns from an accusation into a homecoming. And that is the part we cannot lose sight of, because it matters as much as everything else. That 24% European ancestry does not dilute what a Black American is. The 73% African majority is not background. It is the foundation, and the DNA tells that story with just as much precision as it tells the other. A quarter European does not make a Black American any less African, any more than the deep African ancestry inside so many white Southern families makes them any less what they have always claimed to be. Ancestry is not a competition, and this is not a story about a people becoming something other than themselves. The African core held. It survived the Middle Passage, the auction block, and 4 centuries of an economy designed to grind it away. And it is still, by a wide margin, the largest part of who Black Americans are, because the African ancestry is not a vague, undivided mass. It is specific, and it points home. The dominant African signal in most African Americans traces to West Africa, and within that, to particular peoples whose descendants can now, for the first time, put a name to the continent they came from. The genetic data shows strong connections to the peoples of Nigeria, especially the Yoruba, the Esan, and the Igbo. It shows deep roots in the region of modern Angola and the Congo, the parts of West Central Africa from which enormous numbers of people were taken. These are not guesses, they are matches, ancestral links to specific African populations that the slave trade tried to sever, and the DNA has now reconnected, giving a homeland back to people who were taught they could never know theirs. The Micheletti study even uncovered surprises hidden in that African signal, and each surprise turned out to be a piece of history recovered. African Americans carry far more Nigerian ancestry than the transatlantic shipping records alone would predict. For a while that puzzled the researchers, until historians explained it. Enslaved people were not only trafficked across the Atlantic, they were trafficked between and within the Americas for generations, and huge numbers of people from the Nigerian region were first taken to the British Caribbean and only later forced into the United States, carrying their ancestry with them by a longer and crueler road than the records alone revealed. The DNA caught a movement of human beings that the paperwork had missed. The study also found less Senegambian ancestry than expected, and the likely explanation is heartbreaking. Many people from the Senegambia region were rice cultivators in Africa, and because of that skill, they were deliberately sent to the rice plantations of the American South, where standing water bred malaria, and the conditions were so lethal that death rates ran extraordinarily high. Their genetic line among African Americans today is thinner than it should be, not because fewer were taken, but because so many were worked to death before they could leave descendants. The gaps in the DNA are themselves a record of where the dying was worse. So the DNA does 2 things at once. It names the European ancestry and how it came, and it restores the African ancestry the slave trade worked so hard to erase. Both truths live in the same body. Neither cancels the other. and the African foundation remains exactly that, the foundation. Now step back and see what this whole picture actually reveals, because it overturns something America told itself for centuries. The country built its entire racial order on the idea of separation, two distinct races, black and white, cleanly divided, never truly mixing. That was the story slavery needed to justify itself, and it was the story Jim Crow needed to keep the categories rigid. And the DNA of Black Americans exposes it as a fiction. If the average Black American is nearly a quarter European, then the two races that America insisted were separate were, from the very beginning, one deeply intertwined people. The color line was drawn straight through the middle of families that already shared blood. The Harvard scholar Henry Louis Gates Jr., who has spent his career tracing exactly these lineages, said it plainly. For anyone still clinging to the myth of racial purity, this is one more proof that the categories of black and white have always been more porous than we ever imagined. The porousness was not a modern development. It was there in the first generations, forced into being by the very system that claimed the races must never mix. And here's the bitter irony at the center of it. The same enslavers who publicly defended the absolute separation of the races were, in private, the ones violating it. The European ancestry in Black America is not evidence that the color line was respected. It is evidence that the men who built and policed that line were the ones crossing it in the worst possible way, generation after generation. They passed laws forbidding the mixing of the races with one hand and fathered mixed children by force with the other. They stood in public as the guardians of white purity and returned home to make that purity a lie. The DNA does not just reveal mixing, it reveals hypocrisy, written permanently into the blood of the people that hypocrisy victimized. And consider what that meant for the children of those acts. A child born to an enslaved woman, and the man who owned her was, under the law, not his son or daughter, but his property. He could sell his own children. He could work them in his own fields and never acknowledge a thing. The one-drop rule ensured that any European ancestry a black person carried granted them nothing, no name, no inheritance, no status, while the same ancestry in a white family was treated as the very definition of who belonged. The bloodline ran both ways. The rights ran only one, which is why this genetic revelation is not, in the end, a story of dilution or loss. It is a story of recovery. For 400 years, the identities of those European ancestors were deliberately kept blank. Slavery erased names, it severed lineages. It left millions of Black Americans with a European surname and no history to explain it, a lighter complexion and no ancestor to attach it to, a family tree with a wall built across it exactly where the truth would have been. The people who committed these acts made sure their names would not survive in the record. They counted on being forgotten. For most of them, for most of history, that plan worked perfectly. The DNA does not forget. It carries the ancestry forward with perfect patience, generation after generation, indifferent to every attempt to erase it. And now, with modern testing, it hands it back. A Black American today can open their results and see, for the first time, the specific European populations that entered their line, the region of Africa their people were taken from, the shape of a history that was stolen from them at gunpoint. The surname that never made sense suddenly has an origin. The complexion that went unexplained finally has an ancestor behind it. The wall built across the family tree comes down, and behind it stands the truth that was hidden there all along. The tests even connect living relatives across the color line, linking the descendants of the enslaved to the descendants of the enslavers, closing a circle that was broken by force 2 centuries ago. All across the country, Black families and white families who share nothing but a hidden great-great-grandfather are being matched to one another by an algorithm reading the DNA neither side could argue with. Some of those meetings are painful, some are healing. All of them are the recovery of a connection that slavery created and then commanded everyone to deny. A white family that always believed its history was simple opens the door to a Black cousin who is the living descendant of what their ancestor did, a black family that never had a name for the man in their bloodline finally gets one. Neither side chose this history, but the DNA has made it undeniable, and undeniable is the first step toward honest. So when you learn that the average black American is nearly a quarter European, understand exactly what you are hearing. You are not hearing that black Americans are less African than they believed. You are hearing the recovery of a truth that slavery tried to bury with its victims. Every percentage point of European ancestry is the fingerprint of a real person and a real act, named at last by the science in a record that can no longer be edited or denied. Black Americans were never who the history books said they were. They were always the living proof of everything America tried to hide about itself, carrying in their own bodies the names of the powerful, the origins of the stolen, and the unbroken thread of a people who survived it all. Every black American is, in a sense, a walking archive, holding the truth of the plantation, the truth of the Middle Passage, and the truth of a nation that wrote one story in its laws and left the opposite story in the blood. The record was erased, the blood remembered, and now at last it is speaking, and the country is being made to listen to a history it spent 400 years trying not to hear. What was once written in fear is now being read back in truth, one result at a time. In the next video, we follow that thread to the enslavers themselves and the growing number of white American families discovering through these same DNA tests that the people their ancestors owned were also, in the most literal sense, their family. If this opened your eyes, subscribe and stay with us, because we are only just beginning to recover what the record tried so hard to erase.